Hello and welcome back to Parley, where you folks support me by paying me every month to discuss the topic of your choice. And this month, Lord Rusty has chosen what makes a good ritual. This question is about what it says it's about, and I'm going to briefly summarize what I think before we get into some example spells that you've prepared that you wanted to show me to aid in the discussion. Rituals in Dungeons and Dragons in 5th edition are spells which allow you to cast them with generally a 10-minute casting time instead of their normal casting time, often one action. So you take much longer to cast them rather than basically immediately. You have to wait 10 minutes. And in exchange, they don't consume a spell slot so long as you're a ritual caster. So they give you another flexible way to cast the spell. For example, Speak with Animals is a ritual. You can cast it as an action. Let's say you see an animal attacking you right now, right away. There's a bear. You're going to get mauled by a bear. You probably want to cast Speak with Animals, not as a ritual, as an action, but that takes a spell slot. On the other hand, if you know you're going to go talk to a den of bears and ask them about the weather or something, then you could spend the time casting the ritual, or you know you're going to be going into the jungle, so you prepare it or whatever. These spells are often balanced by their duration or the fact that you have to prepare them anyway and you don't know if they'll be useful, like they might be situational. And so that's where we get into answering this question a little bit. I think from a player's perspective, what makes a good ritual is that the spell be a spell that you'd want the effect of in a situation where you can sit down and cast it for 10 minutes. Pretty simple. And so, of course, from a design perspective, you want to challenge that in some way. Speak with Animals, that example. It's feasible you'd want to use that spell both when you immediately need it and when you would know you would need it. So it makes sense for it to be a ritual and for that to not be the only way you can cast the spell. Like there's a point in not casting it as a ritual. Augury is another good example. Now, Augury is a spell that basically just lets you ask the powers that be for advice about a course of action you wish to take. The problem there is that that could give you value anywhere. And so if it's a ritual, during downtime, you could just spam it over and over again because it's free as long as you spend the 10 minutes, which is why Augury gets less accurate every time you cast it in a given day. The designers know that that would be a thing. So pretty straightforwardly, some cost if it's too safe to cast it as a ritual. I can imagine some combat uses of Augury that would be a little silly. But anyway, I think that's pretty simple. Having there be some cost to the spell being a ritual, despite the fact that the ritual spell is not charging you a spell slot, is, in my opinion, kind of what makes them interesting. That cost could be that it is inconvenient to need that much time to do that effect in some situations. It could be that it consumes a component or requires an expensive component to perform, like needing a crystal ball to cast some kind of divination. You have to go purchase that expensive item and then you have it and you can do that thing, or maybe it consumes some expensive component, something like that. I thought I remembered seeing a rule somewhere about how you do or do not consume components or need components or something when you do a ritual. But anyway, I mean, that would be something different playgroups would decide about on their own anyway. Yeah, rituals are interesting. They give spellcasters a way to kind of do more meaningful magical things throughout the day without running out of spell slots that they could use for combat efficacy. And this makes them somewhat similar to cantrips. Cantrips being the spells you can always spam as much as you want. And so rituals could also be viewed as kind of like long casting time cantrips. That's kind of from a design perspective, they do that. They're the magic you can do all the time, but it takes a little bit longer. Whereas you can do prestidigitation, some sparks come out of your wrist, you make a flower appear, you clean off your robes magically, instantly, as much as you want. Instantly. Cool. So to Rusty's question, I've been thinking about ritual spells in 5th edition. What makes a good ritual spell? I'm trying to unpack this question, so I've been making more spells with the ritual tag, trying to feel out where it's appropriate to use, and I put them in a linked document, so I read over them before this parlay. I've also included an item I made which affects rituals. Well, feel free to include any examples from this you think are particularly good or bad implementations of rituals, but I'm more interested in what you think about rituals as a game piece in general, and what they should be trying to achieve. Well, or what they simply can achieve. And you also have a spoilered out part that you said you'd like to hear my thoughts first, but then I'll read that. So we'll come back to that later. Yes, so you got 4 ritual spells. I've read them and I'm going to kind of summarize them, talk about them. But yeah, some interesting options. I can see in a lot of these that you've done what I was describing, where like for a lot of them, it's an action, or you could cast it as a ritual, and the spell is conceivably good in combat for a few of them, or out of combat. So, for example, Spirit Visage. This is a second level illusion spell for warlocks, bards, and wizards, and it's a touch range spell that lasts a minute. And when you touch the creature, basically you're going to be putting a mask on them, and that lets them see into the ethereal plane while blinding them to the material plane. You could use this as a ritual to see into the ethereal plane if you needed to. And you could also use it as an action in combat for a spell slot to blind an opponent by forcing them to see only the ethereal plane. I could also imagine this having some interesting role-playing uses, where you might use the action version to you could play it as like religiously showing someone a vision, and then you have another ally coordinating with you that is in the ethereal plane. In a low or medium magic environment where people aren't so familiar with that, they might think that like they don't know what's going on, and they might think they're seeing a vision that you're showing them or something, having a religious experience of some sort. Interesting. Specifically the mechanics of the spell are different, and personally I think that they're a little bit unnecessarily complicated. You apply the mask with a melee spell attack, but then to remove the mask, the target is opposing your charisma. They're doing a charisma save against your spell save DC. You could just make them the same thing, I think. But if you want them to be different, that's okay. I just feel like it just makes the spell longer. I don't think it's particularly more or less balanced. You can still have it be a range of touch, even if it's not a spell attack. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Again, a good example of a spell that there is some restriction. I also think the range is an interesting restriction, right? Having a spell that you might cast as a ritual, but then even after that 10-minute time, like you do, it is still touch range, is also interesting. It's an action, but it's touch too. So it's like, even if you were to prepare it from far away, there's some risk that rituals with range could be used as like a sniping ability, you know? You could get sight on a target, like lurking in the bushes at a gala, and you're going to assassinate someone, and you might be able to cast a spell as a ritual by just like hiding in the bushes while staring at them from far away for some spells. So making the range shorter, that's not always good. Maybe it's cool to be able to do that, but that does kind of change it. Having kind of like a ritual sniper is interesting, but probably fairly overpowered. You'd be tempted to just do that at the beginning of every fight, which maybe that lets your players set up ambushes, but it also causes them to have gastrointestinal action because they're just sitting around digesting while the fight is going to begin. So that's a question. There's a question about that tool, but I think it's really interesting that this spell is touch. For this spell, not the biggest deal, but the next spell, I think it is. This spell is called Dark Binding. It's a wizard and warlock 3rd level necromancy spell. The casting time is 1 action or a ritual, so 10 minutes. The range is touch. It's a 1-minute concentration spell. 1-minute concentration, we'll come back to that. You place a seal upon any creature you can see, but the range is touch. Anyway, the target must make a dexterity save or be affected. Once the seal is upon a creature, any damage dealt to that creature grants the caster temp hit points equal to half the damage dealt. If damage is dealt to the caster, that's halved, and an equal amount is dealt to the target. So basically what's happening here is you're kind of damage binding the two people. So why an action and a ritual? Well, you can use it in combat offensively. You do it to an enemy you're fighting, and when you deal damage to them, you get temporary hit points equal to half the damage dealt, a very powerful dueling effect. And then if you take damage, they take some of that damage instead. My problem with this is that it's just extremely broken in combat. It's touch, which again, you see what I mean? I think it's very meaningful with this spell. That's good, like I think it should be touch. But I believe this is far too powerful. You almost instantly win a fight against even a significantly more powerful opponent if you cast this on them. If they fail that dex save and you don't lose concentration within a round or two, they're screwed. Like, it's almost impossible for them to beat you. You have given yourself an almost 4 times health multiplier. You basically have resistance to their damage, and when you damage them, it's like you heal yourself as well, like for free, and you have resistance to their damage. That's ridiculous. Like it's just like basically an instant win against a single target. So I think it's way too strong. Like this is just broken. But you said you wanted to talk about rituals. I like that it's touch. It being a ritual is interesting. You might be thinking, like, wait, why is it a ritual? The audience is thinking, well, you could do it to an ally. So if you do it to your fighter friend or whatever, then if they take damage, then you get temporary hit points, which keeps you safer. And then if you take damage, they take some of the damage instead. So you are significantly harder to kill at the expense of them being a bit easier to kill. Enemies can divide their fire, or very intelligent enemies might focus fire you because you have lower AC and they will get more attacks through, which will damage your fighter. They have a point of vulnerability, which is interesting. Again, pretty powerful. I think that use of it isn't so bad. You'd want to add text about the target being allowed to voluntarily fail the save, but that's the main ritual use. I mentioned the 1 minute concentration duration. For the use case where if you damage them, you get 10 hit points, they damage you, you have resistance, and they take some of the damage. When you do it on an enemy, the 1 minute duration is really strong. But when you do it on an ally with a ritual cast, that makes it the situation where you'd be able to do this is narrowing, which is maybe good because this is a powerful effect. You need a situation where you will be in a fight well within 1 minute, but you can also ritual cast for 10 minutes right before that fight. So you like know there are some goblins behind the door, and you sit out in front of it and very quietly ritual cast for 10 minutes and then break down the door. That could happen, like I suppose. And this is a somewhat open-ended spell, so I think that's okay. The idea that the ritual cast or not ritual casting a ritual spell is like much more niche. And then there's, this is useful in almost every fight, unless you're fighting many, many, many small enemies. Any fight with a single meaningful enemy, or just a tankier enemy among smaller enemies, this is good, not as a ritual. And there would also be situations occasionally where it would be good as a ritual. I think that's cool, having it be that the spell gives you a little more open-endedness is nice. What I like about this kind of thing, what really the purpose of this is, rather than it just being two different spells, in my opinion, is that it makes the spells feel more like real magical acts that you're performing. Does that make sense? It really feels like a more immersive thing when it doesn't do this one stated mechanical thing, and you can instead just kind of do it. You can bind people together, not specifically an enemy in you, but also an ally in you. It's more open-ended. You're gaining the ability to bind people together. It being an enemy or an ally isn't necessarily distinguished, which I think is good. I think that's quite immersive as a spell design. So that's really cool. Again, I think the problem from a design perspective, if we wanted to get into it, which you didn't ask for, but I thought I'd find that fun, is that against enemies, this is just extremely broken. Like it's so broken. My first idea is they get a save at the end of every turn to end the effect for free, for no action economy cost. That's still pretty good, but then it has the risk where, like, if you use your action to cast this on an enemy and then they pass their save, you basically wasted it. They have to fail their save, and then it starts to get nutty, so there's a payoff in exchange for that risk. Another thing is it's not too crazy unless they hurt you, which means you could lose concentration, which makes it more fair. But in a situation where that's the only way it will break, I think this is just busted. You could pretty easily just have a good con save, and then if they try to fight you after a turn or two, the health gap, the advantage you get from this is so enormous that there's no way they'll beat you. You could defeat enemies far stronger than yourself they just fail one save, which is a lot. I kind of want it to be a constitution save as well. I also like the idea that, it could fail because you fail your con save. Then it becomes kind of like a battle between the two con saves, which I think is thematic. It also elegantly, if you can choose to fail the save and voluntarily be affected, like when you use it on an ally, that elegantly solves the problem where, like, 1 minute is actually a bit restrictive for an ally, but way too much for an enemy. That elegantly solves that problem by you don't have to change the duration. We can leave it as niche on an ally and then like a combat option. It's kind of a risk in combat. Sure. Another thought I had just briefly is maybe this spell should be level 4. Maybe this should be a 4th level spell. This feels like a decently powerful effect. This is also the kind of effect that it's like, it's weird, right? Because it doesn't, it's by the amount of damage being dealt, it's just halves, which is interesting. Finally, I wanted to mention that you didn't state a duration for the temporary hit points, which, like, most players just won't abuse that, but some will. You should have them wear off at the end of the spell's duration. Temporary hit points, of course, don't stack, but your players could get up to some bullshit if you let them out of combat. Anyway, make the temporary hit points expire. That's my advice, especially because it's a ritual. That encourages those shenanigans. Cool. So those two really interesting examples. I like the touch range thing as well, for spells like this, especially when they're rituals. I think it helps with that. It's interesting, but abuse case really, where there's a chance that you might like be able to see a target that you could affect offensively from far away. You might get a weird vantage point, and that suddenly becomes like a disproportionately overpowered benefit if you have a ritual that is good to offensively cast that isn't the range of touch. That's something interesting. But that could be kind of cool too. Like I could kind of get down with like some sort of elaborate ritual. You could even maybe have it be like some visual effects appear in the environment as you're casting it, but then you could use illusion magic, or your party members could use illusion magic to hide the fact that you're building up a magical effect, and then you like flame strike them at the end or something. That's kind of neat. But anyway, you have two more ritual spells. The first one is really interesting use of a ritual. Again, the one thing I think is a theme about these is that they are to some degree like you could sort of prepare for combat with that Dark Binding spell we talked about. This one is like that too. It's called Glyph of Returning. It's a 3rd level abjuration for wizards, sorcerers, and bards. The range and the duration and the casting time I'm going to get back to later because they don't make sense to me, and I'll talk about why. But basically what this spell does is it lets you create a little glyph on the ground, and then you connect yourself to that glyph using an ethereal thread. If you or a copy of yourself that appears in the glyph when you finish casting take damage, you get teleported back to the glyph and the spell ends. So you kind of bind yourself. It reminds me a lot of, you folks know Apex Legends Revenant's Death Totem. You touch it, hide it somewhere, and then you rush the enemies. And if you lose like half your health, a certain threshold, you teleport back to the totem. So it lets you go ham, and then you go back if it's unsafe. Pretty interesting. You connect yourself to the illusory copy of yourself in the circle with a thread that only people who can see into the ethereal plane can see. So that's interesting. You basically get to, again, like go ham on something. You get very reckless, and then if you get hurt and things are going a little bit south, you jump back. And it's balanced by the fact that like just getting hurt one time, you take any damage and you go back. You can't like meaningfully fight but then be protected from death. If there's a fight like at all, you're probably going to go back, which I think is good balancing. So a couple of things. First of all, I don't like that this is likely never useful not as a ritual. This is a spell that I reckon also probably shouldn't be a ritual because it will encourage your players to do it before every fight. That's kind of how I feel. Any situation that is remotely dangerous, the range is 500 feet, so there would be no reason not to ritual cast this before pretty much any fight, which is why I think you made the casting time 1 hour, which I also think is weird, right? In player time, 1 hour and 10 minutes, like there is a meaningful role-playing difference, but in practice, I don't think the player is going to perceive that as being that different. For your own playgroup, maybe you have ways of doing that, but I think in general, certainly, I wouldn't recommend that to most playgroups. I think most people, that doesn't make a difference. And it just makes it hilariously impractical as not a ritual, when in fact this costing a spell slot would be a good way to balance it. You've introduced another way to balance it. This spell costs components that are worth 100 gold. I like the idea that there is some other cost. It's not a spell slot, but it's money. I just don't know if this spell really warrants that. Again, allowing your players to just sort of spam this, and it's not limited by spell slots. Another thing I think is elegant about making this cost a spell slot is that it can be very useful for hit and run tactics, or like you raid a camp and then leave. If this costs a spell slot, you sacrifice a bit of your offensive arsenal however little, to do the spell, meaning you could have used that spell slot to like fireball the group instead, which creates a wait. Again, not only is there literally a cost, a spell slot, the player also thinks about like, I could literally just use that spell slot to fireball them and run away. Do I need this effect, or do I simply want this effect? And that makes it more of a choice, I think. So personally, I would advocate making this a spell that simply lasts 10 minutes to cast. It just takes 10 minutes to cast, and the duration is 10 minutes. The duration could be shorter. Could this be an action? Could this have a casting time of 1 minute? Yes. Make the casting time and the duration both 1 minute. Remove the ritual tag. And I think you can remove the material component. Here's what I think you should do. Make the thread be a special thread that costs money to acquire, but doesn't get consumed. So there's some upfront cost. I like that for this type of spell because it's meant to be a situational combat option for engaging a group. You make there be an upfront component purchase cost, but then it becomes a choice the player unlocks. So it's like, by default, if the player doesn't have a plan, you probably don't want them to be just constantly using this spell. But if they do, then it isn't actually that costly for them to like get in the door, 500 foot of spectral ectoplasm coated thread, worth 500 gold pieces, worth a gold piece per foot. Wow, hyper expensive thread. That kind of appeals to me somehow. I don't know. So that's what I would do. I think this is a good example of a spell that maybe doesn't need the ritual tag. But this is a great example spell. There are so many different knobs you can turn. I like making it 1 minute casting time, 1 minute duration, material component that costs money to acquire but is not consumed. The idea being that it is a different tactical option the player can unlock if they wish to. There is also something to remember that this spell is only learned by classes that learn their spells, like sorcerers and bards, and the wizard. Oh, the wizard might find it in a spell book, but they already had to choose this spell as one of their learned spells. Acquiring a component for these spells as well can be a little dangerous, but they can retrain it, of course, if they feel like, I picked this and I'm excited to use it and I have to go acquire the component. But then after a level, they think, I was never wanting to be able to cast this, and then they just retrain it. So I guess that's fine. Anyway, really interesting one. And then we have one more. Rylai's Shard of True Ice. This is a wizard, sorcerer, druid, and bard spell. It's a 6th level conjuration. It's basically cryo sleep. You touch an object or objects or a medium creature, occupying 10 square feet in total or less. They have to be still for the duration of the spell, which is 1 minute. And it has the ritual tag, so 10 minutes you can cast it without using a slot. The duration is indefinite until dispelled, and you can only dispel it by using this again. I think Dispel Magic should definitely work if they do a high level enough one, but you can use this spell to end it and like thaw the subject. It also makes a big pillar of ice that does hurt enemies that touch it. You can also destroy it, and it's vulnerable to fire, which deals a bunch of damage to the creatures inside. But basically, it's like cryo sleep. This is an interesting one. One thing I wanted to come back to is the idea that, like, you remember I was saying you sort of get a good vantage point and cast a ritual offensively, sort of in combat, or like right when you're going to start combat. The idea that there would be like a hyper powerful ritual effect you could do, but you need to immobilize or like stall the target you're fighting for a moderate length of time, 1 minute, is interesting. I've done fights in my campaign before. There's a whole series of fights in my campaign that involve creatures that are kind of charging up divine power, and in 1 minute they'll be full of that. So the players have 10 rounds to decide the course of the fight. Otherwise, something else kind of happens. This prevents fights from getting drawn out. It means that they care about how quickly they complete the fight. They're encouraged to be a bit more aggressive. And there's also some kind of storytelling moment where perhaps the fight doesn't result in everyone killing each other every single time. And the idea that this is a spell that you could like stall a target or restrain a target in combat for 1 minute and then you just ice them and they're frozen solid is very cool. And then if you wanted to use it to simply preserve food or an ally's body, you could ritual cast it for 10 minutes instead. There is a lot of overlap with this spell in Gentle Repose. You mentioned that it basically does that. You could freeze a body and it freezes time for the body. Something I think is a bit rough about this spell in that case is that like Revivify is within 1 minute. There's this thing that is kind of a pet peeve of mine in D&D. If you cast this with a spell slot with a casting time of 1 minute, so many players will say like, but because it was an action, the body was unfrozen for 1 minute and 6 seconds. So you can't use Revivify. These amounts of time are abstractions. Of course you can use Revivify on the, I don't know, you decide for yourself. But anyway, that's fine. That's not your fault. That's just a D&D thing. So I like this idea. I gather that the reason to cast it not as a ritual, is meant to be like, what if the target, can you keep an enemy you're fighting still long enough, or like plan the fight in such a way where you can touch them and freeze them. Now, another interesting thing about this spell is it doesn't have a save. There's no save. So imagine like your allies go and harass the boss and then run away. And you're just in the hallway chilling, ritual casting this spell or normal casting it or whatever. And then when 1 minute is up, perfectly coordinating the time of your allies running past, you just like boop the boss on the shoulder and they freeze solid. That's badass, and you would have to do a lot of work to coordinate that. I like the idea that this is a different way to resolve that type of fight. And then you have to, I didn't like the touch thing at first, but it's a good limitation for this type of thing, especially if there's no save. It might be kind of interesting if it had some range, like 60-foot range, medium range, but they did get a save. That's interesting, but I kind of like the absolute nature of this. It's cool. Anyway, I don't have a whole lot else to say. The idea of a spell that isn't normally an action to cast being meaningful as a ritual, like it's still a minute to cast it normally, but it's 10 minutes as a ritual. Does that really matter? I think like in a fight, that could potentially matter. You might be able to draw out the fight for a minute in D&D, but 10 minutes is pretty absurd in most scenarios. Unless the fight basically stops. You're not going to do 10 minutes of rounds of combat. Your group will hate that. You don't want that. That's interesting. Cool. Let's hear what you had to say about rituals, and then I want to read this ritual item you described. So we talked a lot about rituals. Let's hear what Lord Rusty had written from the beginning. My thoughts are that we mainly see rituals used as a way to adjust power budget, or a way to encourage spells with niche uses to be included in a character's known spells, and it's almost exclusively used for utility spells. That's mostly true, I think. I don't know about power budget. I think that a lot of ritual spells, if a spell wouldn't have really ever felt like a good use of a spell slot, you can then make it a ritual and it costs something different, time, instead. That's reasonable. I think there's a space mechanically for rituals to do very different tasks in and out of combat, which is what you did with a lot of these. That's true. I've attempted to push this envelope with two of the spells on my list. Spirit Visage and Dark Binding are spells I included, which have a combat use and a utility use you'd only want to use as a ritual, which I'm curious what you think of. Yeah, again, I think that Spirit Visage comes pretty close to being a spell. This is the one where you put a mask on someone's face. They see the ethereal plane and not the physical one. This is the first one we talked about. That one comes close to being like, this is just two different spells. There already are spells that do something very close to this, not in combat. And so in combat, there are also other spells that blind people. I don't like that one, to be honest with you, but I do think it's an interesting example of the concept. Dark Binding, like I was saying, I think is a good example of a spell that lets you do, it gives you an ability. It feels like real magic. You get an ability, and it's designed in a way where you would naturally come to the realization that you could use it in and out of combat. That feels very well designed. I think that's cool. Again, I think without getting a free save every turn to resist it, it's hilariously broken against enemies, but that's beside the point. I think that one does that pretty well, so I thought that was a great example. I think that's pretty cool. I think you did provide pretty good examples of this, all in all. That's really interesting. I also think like something hard about homebrewing spells is you kind of have to know every spell that players would be familiar with. Again, to even know if there is a spell that overlaps with a lot of these. Maybe there are spells that overlap with some of these that I don't even know, but like, in this group of spells, Gentle Repose came up. The range of other teleporting spells came up with Glyph of Returning. Spirit Visage, again, like there are kind of spells existing that do one or the other half of this spell. I'm not sure I want there to be one spell. You can learn only one spell and you get both those capabilities. I'm not sure I even want that. And then Dark Binding, I think, is a fairly unique, again, pretty strong effect. Again, as written, I think it's really overpowered, but you could change that. These are great examples. I want to read your Ritual Bells item. This is a reference to Sabriel, I confirmed with you. Sabriel, a book I really enjoyed when I was in early college? I don't remember when. I read it a long time ago, but I liked it. Ritual Bells, an item that interacts with rituals. It's a wondrous item, rare, requires attunement. It's a bandolier holding a series of bells in leather pouches, each with the symbol of a different school of magic carved into the leather. There are 8 ritual bells, each corresponding to a different school of magic, ranging from the illusion bell, which is the smallest, and makes a gentle twinkle when rung, which goes up to the necromancy bell, which sounds a discordant clang when it chimes. This is awesome. The bells can be found as a collection or as individual items. For the purposes of attunement, your entire collection of ritual bells counts as one item no matter how many you possess. The bells have 2 features. The first is that they cut the time it takes to cast a ritual in half for their relevant school and remove any concentration requirements for ritual casting. Okay, interesting. I'll come back to that. The second feature of the bells is that they allow you to detect rituals being cast around you if you are carrying the corresponding bell. Each bell in your collection extends the range of this feature by 1 mile for an 8-mile radius if you're in possession of all of the bells. If a ritual is cast in the area, the corresponding bell's symbol will glow. You can then choose to ring the bell, which will make both you and the ritual caster aware of each other's location, as well as letting you see through each other's eyes for one action. Ooh. The bell ringer will be able to navigate to the ritual site, and the ritual caster will be able to spot where the bell was being rung. Both parties will retain the ability till the end of their long rest. You can use each bell this way once per day. Interesting. Okay. So a few thoughts. First, about the simpler part. They let you cast rituals in 5 minutes instead of 10. I don't think that does anything. I think in practice, because of the way that D&D is often, like, time is perceived, it doesn't actually make a difference in practice. Just like I was saying, I feel like 10 minutes and 1 hour are very different in real life. But in D&D, I think in the course of gameplay, it's not often that different. You know your play group, and I don't, but I think for a lot of players, that doesn't do a lot. The concentration requirement thing is interesting. The idea that, like, for something like the Rhyolite Shard of True Ice, where you tap the person and freeze them, you could maybe do that in the middle of combat to some extent, and then your ally grapples the boss and drags them over. But then the boss will know you're doing that and, like, fire magic missiles at you. And then this is hilariously overpowered for that one single individual use case, and there is literally no other time in all of D&D where that matters. But my bias as a game designer is to make simpler items in the name of readability. I don't want my players to have to remember as much stuff. So personally, I just think that part of the feature doesn't do enough. The main feature of the bells, then, is that they let you detect rituals being cast in a huge radius. So this is what I want to talk about a bit more. This does rely on you as a DM running the game in such a way where your characters, your NPCs, are, like, running by the rules. People do this to varying degrees. There are some DMs that all of their NPCs that can use magic are literally a player character. Just, they didn't fully flesh them out, maybe. So they're all casting a spell that is, like, really one of the spells the player could know of. I like this. I do think it creates some limitations, but it would be simple enough to just homebrew a ritual that's happening when you needed to and just assign it, like a school or whatever. That's not really a huge problem. So that could be okay. I'm trying to think, though, about, like, what this would be for. An immediate thing that comes to mind would be you could be given a job to hunt down like a group of cultists or whatever. They're on a wanted list. And so you think like we should go to a magic item auction and look for things that would help us do this. And then you, the DM, can stock that auction with items that would be various approaches to finding the cultists, you know? You could include a love potion to seduce one of the cultists. You could include these bells to track down the ritual location, etc., etc. And then the players get to choose like which of these, maybe they cost different things, maybe different people are bidding on them, etc. The players get to have an immersive experience of choosing which item they want to use for that approach. And of course, they maybe still have it afterward, and so they can think about that. Maybe your players don't use rituals that much and you want to show them that other enemies are, so you give them these bells, which lets you do the thing. It's a cool idea. The idea of like tracking down the ritual person, the idea that you then see each other, you kind of like synchronize with them by ringing the bell is very cool. I almost want to take that further. Like, can more happen to like merge you and the ritual caster? Like you can produce the effect of the ritual at your location as well, or something. Like I would say maybe like there could be a very open-ended and broad spectrum way in which you synchronize with the ritual caster. You can speak what they speak, like mimic their body motions, including maybe casting the effect of the spell at the end. I'm not sure you'd ever want to do that, but that could lead to really emergent role-playing. It's also easy to remember, like you literally just get to mimic the ritual caster. You don't have to worry about the particular rules of that. Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. It's also a really good way to teach the players about magic. Like if you have a higher magic setting with a lot of magic in it, this is a good way to make the players more aware that magic is being used a lot around them, that magic of different schools like is certain things. Like you could then identify that. It would be a really interesting moment too in a city with a ton of magic going on, maybe in the criminal underground or the sewers. They ring the, illusion bell, and it turns out it pings off like 10 places within only a few miles, and the players are like, what? This seemed like a totally normal city. And then suddenly that's really creepy. This is a very useful like DM's item. The player might not initially want this item, but it's an interesting item to have in your world. In fact, I may use this myself. That's really cool. It's an interesting idea. I do understand that it doesn't feel very elegant to have these bells make you know better at casting rituals. Like that's awkward. I get that. Could you perhaps store the last ritual you synchronize with using each bell, allowing you to hold more rituals when they were like part of the story of the campaign? It doesn't let them like deliberately learn a new ritual, but they will get more. Not very many more either, and not very many more of one school. I think so. I think that could be cool. They'll then seek out enemies that they can synchronize with that ritual, and then they've like stored, Magic Mouth as a ritual in one of their bells, and then they have it. And then maybe using them again would have that cost. They'll lose the spell that's in there. That's a bit of bookkeeping, but you can put it on the spellcasting part of their character sheet. And I don't know, I think players might enjoy that. That's cool. I like these bells, not just because I enjoy what they're a reference to. That's a cool idea. Again, I don't think that making rituals shorter to cast is very meaningful, and I think that making them not concentration is almost always meaningless, but then hilariously broken in like a corner case situation. But that's my bias as a game designer. That's just my own feedback about that. Really cool, really interesting. I like talking about spells like this. It's challenging, but in a way that stretches the brain. Thank you very much, Lord Rusty. Thank you for the awesome question. I hope you don't mind me purloining that ritual bells item.